She was sold at dawn for a pocketful of coins. That is what the town would whisper later when the sun had gone down and the saloon lights had burned lower than pride allows. The truth was simpler and crueler. The man who sold her needed bread and whiskey. The market needed bodies and quick money. The law had turned a blind eye because the law kept itself busy with things that glittered and not with what broke. The world on that side of the ridge had rules that were loud and rules that were quiet. The quiet rules made room for bargains that had no mercy. The first time the cowboy saw her, she stood at the edge of the square like a pale ghost. Dawn had hardly unrolled itself. Mist clung to the planks of the walk. Hands moved under flannel like shadows. The auctioneer used a voice like a bell to call names and prices and promises that meant less than nothing after the coins hit leather. Men leaned forward in their coats and watched as if they were watching a thing that belonged to someone else. The girl did not move with the motion of the crowd. She watched the ground where dust and straw met. Her eyes held a look like a wound asking not to be opened. He came in on a horse that had seen better springs. He kept his hat low for habit and for the way the wind carries news. People who ride find they learn how to be quiet. He had the quiet hands of a man who knows rope and repair and how to look away from trouble because looking would make the trouble his. Yet that morning he did not look away. He felt the smallness of the coins in his fingers and the weight of the choice in his chest. The pocketful had sweat in it from someone else. The idea of a price for a person had a smell that made his stomach hollow. The auctioneer named a price. A coin changed hands. A voice laughed. The girl felt the word owner like a hardtack on the tongue. Men thought they bought work. Men thought they bought an answer. They did not see the part of a human that holds a name and a story. They did not reckon with the thing that keeps a soul from breaking when nails and boards tell you you are less than worth. The cowboy waited until the crowd thinned. He watched how the men walked away light, as if they had not carried anything. He saw how the one who bought the girl had not looked at her face. He watched the buyer lift a sack and strap it to a cart. He saw the girl walk beside and keep her hands folded as if in prayer. He thought of his own sister. He thought of the woman who had left him a long time ago with a note and a pocket watch. Feeling can be a slow animal. It wakes, it moves, it decides. He stepped into the lane that led away from the square. The cart moved toward the trail out of town. The buyer kept his head down. The horse that drew the cart stamped once, then again, as if it wanted something kinder than this road offered. The cowboy rode the horse that had been given to him by a friend who had died in a storm. He rode steady and spoke little. Most of the time men who were alone spoke to the earth and not to men. The earth listens and does not lie. He rode beside the cart and did not ask permission. Sometimes there is no room to ask. The buyer turned slow and spat at him. "Mind your business." The words were soft and sharp. The cowboy looked at the man for a long moment. He had the simple face of a man who would rather a debt be paid than a heart be saved. "Ain't yours to sell." The cowboy said nothing more. He did not need more words. The girl looked up then. Her face broke into a shape like a beaten flag. She tried to say something. The buyer's hand closed on the rein. The world holds its breath at small acts of courage. The cowboy pulled his hat back and set his jaw. There are men who will step between pain and person because they cannot stand the mirror in their cups. He stepped down and put a hand on the cart. It was a light touch. It was honest. The buyer scowled. "You think to steal from me?" He sounded as if he believed theft had a cause that could be named. The cowboy's hand stayed where it was. "I think a girl has a name." The words came easy because they were true. The buyer laughed at that like a thing that had not been meant to earn laughter. He slapped the cowboy's shoulder where a ring of old scars made a knot. The blow was meant to make a man small. The cowboy bit the feeling away like a man who knows how to keep a horse steady. A fist rose, then fell. The cart lurched. A bottle cracked free and glass sang a tune on the wood. People who had been watching remembered that there was an auction still, and they shuffled back like leaves in a wind. It takes little to make a man rise who has had enough. The cowboy had had enough of certain kinds of size and enough of men who think a coin erases a life. He did not draw his gun. He used his weight. The good of a man sometimes shows in muscle and in a shoulder that will not bend for the sake of someone else, pride or fear. The buyer hit the dirt. The cart toppled. For one slow, bright second the coins that had paid for a person scattered across the ground like a small, ugly treasure. The town gasped and then forgot to gasp because life is quick to forget what is true when it smells like trouble. The girl stood where she was and blinked like a startled bird. Her face had a kind of hollow courage. He set the coins back into the buyer's hand, then did something that surprised himself and perhaps the town more. He took the girl by the shoulder in the gentlest way he could. He did not ask her name. He did not tell her his. He helped her to the horse like a man helping a wounded thing to stand. People watched the two of them and read the scene into the way they needed the story to be. They walked through the dust that held the small marks of a town that had not been kind to tenderness. He led the horse out of sight of men who had spent the morning buying what they thought they could own. He led the horse to the old river path that wound beneath cottonwoods. The water moved like a memory. He sat with the girl on a log and watched how the sun cut the mist. She held her hands like they were trying to hide something. "You can go back," he said the words with a small and hard kindness. You can go back to him and to the one that sold you and pretend the world is right. He had seen men pretend that before. Or you can come with me a while and see what it is to be called by your own name. She turned her face toward him then. Her eyes were small, bright things. They held something like surprise. Maybe she had not thought the world allowed choices. Maybe to her it had seemed that men placed coins in sealed doors and that was all there was. She nodded then slow. The nod was an act of more defiance than any fist. They did not speak much after that. The cowboy had learned the art of moving quiet. It keeps one from saying things that might break. He tied the horse and watched the river take leaves and twigs. He passed the folded coins from hand to hand like a thing that needed to be counted and then put away. Money has a way of making men do good and ugly things. It does not know the face of mercy. The girl told him her name when night turned the sky long and blue. She said it simple like a prayer. Clara. The name lay between them like light. He had a name for her in his head already. He did not say it. Names are stubborn things. They can be given and taken in silence and in fists. Clara fit her like a glove that had waited. He told her his name later that night when the stars had turned and a small fire burned like a careful apology. He said the name and it sounded like a place to stay for the length of a breath. Days passed in small lights. The cowboy taught Clara how to mend a harness. He showed her how to hold a rope so that it would not know panic. She listened the way someone listens when every new thing might be a key. She would watch his hands and try to make hers do the same. The work was honest and it gave both of them space to be simple and therefore brave. The town did not forget easily. Rumor moves faster than truth because rumor needs the speed of gossip to survive. Men spat under their hats. Women pointed with eyes that did not have the courage to say the word pity out loud. Some of them called him a fool. Some called him a saint. He did not need either. He needed the measure of a life that could sleep at night without the weight of a lie. One evening a man came down from the ridge. He was a trader who knew how to read the weather and men. He carried a letter wrapped in oilskin. He stopped where the log met the river and sat as if he had stopped there before for less than clean reasons and more than that. He looked at them like a man deciding if a story was going to end badly or be saved by a good turn. He asked the cowboy for a cigarette in a voice like the wind. The cowboy gave him one. They watched the smoke together like a small treaty. "You are a stranger to this valley," the trader said. "You came in rough and you took a thing that belonged to a man." The words were direct because some men speak as if the world is a ledger where each act must be balanced. "Why do you carry other people's debts?" The cowboy put his hand on the poker he used to stir the coals. He looked at Clara. She sat like a small honest house in the dark. "Because someone did it once for me," he said. "Because I could not stand the sound of a girl being bought like she was a sack of grain." The trader did not say more. There are things no trade can reckon. He flicked his cigarette into the night and left them with a whisper of smoke. The stars listened. Clara slept more those nights. The things that a mind needs to unlearn are heavy. She dreamed of the square and of men and of coins like small suns. She dreamed of a man with no face who had left a watch on her pillow and a note that said she was less than and therefore was not. She woke with a small hard line to her jaw and then would come out to the log where the cowboy waited and put her hand in his, as if to anchor herself in a place that did not bargain. The cowboy watched the way she stood in the morning. He watched the way she did not speak until she had tied her apron and the coffee had boiled. He watched the small ways that the bone of a person straightens when the wind carries a kind word rather than a price. He felt a thing inside him that people call mercy but which men like to dress up with better words. Mercy is not a fine cloak. It is a hand that will not let go. One afternoon the buyer found them. He came with 2 men and with a hunger that smelled of old debts and cheap whiskey. He stood a ways off and spat into the river. "You stole what was mine," he said. His voice carried over the water like a small threat. The cowboy nodded. "I took what I thought I could live with." He did not say the calculus of hearts because that is a number no man is given to count. The buyer cursed and lifted a rifle because that is what men who feel small hold up like shields. The river smiled and swallowed the words like water swallows driftwood. The cowboy did not pull his gun at first. He waited to see if the man would do the thing that shame makes men do. The buyer fired a shot over the ground to frighten. The sound broke like an old bell. Clara flinched. Her hand went to the place her chest tried to hide behind. The cowboy put himself between the buyer and Clara. He aimed with his eyes and not with his pistol. "You put down your gun or you will sleep with a wound in the dirt," he said. His voice was simple and there was a weight to it the buyer had not bargained for. Men who say little often carry storms. The buyer's fingers trembled. He thought of the coins in his pocket that had paid for the thing that was not worth a coin. For a moment he measured the ledger of his life and found it wanting. He lowered his weapon, though his jaw stayed set. He stomped off with his men cursing. The sound of their boots faded. The river took that sound and made it small. The cowboy stood by the log and watched the buyer go like a man watching a story he did not want to read again. Clara put her hand on his arm then. Her fingers were warm and steady. She looked up at him and said, in a voice that felt like the beginning of a long road, "Thank you." He looked at her and saw the dawn again. He thought of all the mornings he had ridden with nothing in his pockets but the small things that keep a man going. He had once believed that the world was a place where you made your bed and must sleep in it. Clara had taught him that sometimes you must tear the bed to find another way to sleep. They sat by the river until the light leaned and the frogs began their chorus. The town grew and lived and bartered. The life of the valley spun like a wheel. The cowboy and Clara lived the small days that stitch a life together. He taught her to read the sky as a man reads a song. She taught him how to make bread that warmed the hands in winter. They were two people learning to be bone and shelter for the other. Somebody once said that a single person cannot change the world. The cowboy never claimed such things. He only held a horse in a hand and a stubborn refusal to look away. The world turned as it always does, and sometimes it left scars. Yet there were nights when a child would run past their door laughing, and a woman would look up from her chores and not see the ledger of price in a child's face. Those were the nights when a coin could not buy what had been restored. Years later, people would tell different versions of the morning Clara had been sold. Some told it with anger. Some told it with awe. Children would listen with wide eyes and imagine the cowboy as a giant. Old men would shake their heads and say that the world was a strange place where good sometimes won small battles. Clara would tell the story with no coin left in her hand and with a house full of bread. She would tell it lower than the sound of spoons in the bowl, because the story had a softness she wished not to hurt. In the end, they measured mercy not by the size of the coin, but by how many mornings a person could wake with the belief that someone would not sell them for pocketfuls. The cowboy never asked for thanks. He never sat on his porch and waited for a statue. He rode on some mornings and stayed on others. He knew the road would keep calling him. He also knew that some roads needed to end so a life could begin. When the old men spoke of him, they said he had an easy way with a horse and a difficult way with a coin. They said he loved like a man who had been given a second hand at a clock. They said he was no saint. He would not have liked that title. He would not have liked the idea of being a story for others to feast on. He would have liked the idea that one small choice had unmade a wrong. The river still runs past the place where they once sat under the cottonwoods. The bread still warms in ovens at dawn. Children still run barefoot in the sand. There are 1,000 small things that keep feeding a valley. If you walk that trail now, you might see a house with smoke rising and a woman who hums while she washes the pots. You might see a horse tied where a man once fed it. You might even hear a laugh that sounds like the river. If you ask the oldest woman in town, she will tell you about that morning when a pocketful of coins almost took a life. She will tell you about the cowboy who would not look away. Her eyes will get wet at the edges when she says it. Then she will nod like someone who has seen the long work of mercy. She will tell you simply that sometimes a man does the right thing and then the world makes a place for the brave. It is easy to say that one man cannot change things. It is easier still to stand by the window and count coins while the world gets bought and sold. It is harder to walk into the dust and scoop a person up and say they are worth an honest life. The cowboy did the harder thing. He did it not because he wanted to be told a story about himself, but because he could not sleep with the sound of a life being sold in his ears. If you ever find yourself walking a trail and you see a note nailed to a door or a pocketful of coins passed in a market, remember that someone may be holding onto a name with both hands. Remember that a day will come when the choice is yours to make. You can walk on and pretend you did not hear the bell that calls, or you can step into the light and offer a hand. The world remembers those hands. The world makes room for them in the songs that the children hum in the years that follow. He woke before light most mornings. The sky was the color of tin, and the air had that cold that makes a man remember where his bones begin. Clara slept in the small room they had built with their hands. The boards had gaps, but the walls kept out enough wind to make it home. He would rise and step outside and listen to the stillness. Some mornings the stillness felt kind. Some mornings it felt like a reminder that the world keeps its own accounts. He walked to the trough and poured a bucket for the horse. The sound of water was steady and right. He thought about the first time he had seen her eyes and the way the light had come through her hair like smoke. He had thought then that he had saved her. Now he was learning that saving is not a thing you do once. It is a thing you do each day until the person beside you believes in the sun again. Clara came to the doorway with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was softer in the mornings before memory had time to wake. She watched him the way a person watches the tide, quietly and with something like fear. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. She took it with both hands and whispered thanks. He liked the way she said that word. It was not a habit with her, it was a choice. They ate in silence because silence had become the only language that did not bruise. She would look at him sometimes and he could see the questions she was not ready to ask. He did not press her. He knew what it meant to carry a weight too early in the day. When the sun came up, he hitched the horse and rode out toward the ridge. There was a fence that needed mending. He liked work that had edges, work that could be finished. It made him feel like the world had small pieces of order. From the top of the ridge he could see the valley stretched like a prayer that had been half answered. He could see smoke from the town and he wondered what names they were calling him today. In the afternoons she worked the small garden by the side of the house. She planted things that grow slow, beans, carrots, herbs that catch the smell of the wind. He would watch her from the barn sometimes. The way her hands moved had changed. They no longer trembled when they touched the soil. She was beginning to claim the earth as her own again. That sight filled him with a quiet pride he never spoke of. One evening he came home and found her sitting by the fire. She had a piece of paper in her lap. The edges were torn and the words had faded, but he knew what it was. It was the bill of sale from the day she had been sold. She had found it in the drawer where he had hidden it away. He froze at the door. She did not look up at first. When she did, her eyes were clear and heavy with something he could not name. "You kept this," she said. Her voice was soft but not weak. He nodded. "I thought it was mine to bury," he said. She looked down again. "Maybe it is," she said. "But I wanted to see it once more to remember that I was not born from mercy, I was bought from hunger." Then she folded the paper and placed it into the fire. They both watched as the flame took it slow and honest. When it was gone, she leaned back and said, "I think that is enough remembering for tonight." He felt the ache of her words for a long time after. He knew then that her healing was not in forgetting but in owning every scar. That night he slept with the window open and listened to her breathing and thought of the road that had brought them both here. The days turned to weeks and the rhythm of their life began to find shape. He worked the fields. She traded bread with the women in town who did not speak to her but took the bread all the same. He saw the way they looked at her, some with pity, some with envy. Clara carried herself like a woman who owed no explanation. The cowboy found himself proud in a way that made his chest tight. But even peace has a shadow. One morning a rider came from town with a message. The sheriff wanted to speak to him. He went down that same afternoon. The sheriff was a man who liked to keep his hands clean. He looked at the cowboy like a man looks at a riddle he cannot solve. "I heard you took in that girl," the sheriff said. "She was sold under law. You interfered." The cowboy said nothing. The sheriff leaned back. "There are those who think a man who breaks one law will break others." The cowboy met his eyes. "I never broke a law that deserved to be kept," he said. The sheriff studied him and then nodded like a man who knows the truth but does not want to know it out loud. "You keep to yourself and I will keep the law off your porch," he said. The cowboy left without a word. When he got home, Clara was sitting by the door mending a shirt. She looked up when she saw his face. He told her what had been said. She did not seem afraid. She said the law had never done her any good before. He sat beside her and they finished the mending together. It was the first time they had worked the same task side by side and it felt like something real. That night the wind came hard from the north. The house creaked and the fire sputtered. He lay awake listening. She turned to him in the dark and said, "Do you ever wish you had looked away?" He thought for a while. "No," he said. "I only wish I had looked sooner." She reached for his hand then and held it until sleep took them both. In the weeks that followed, the talk in town began to fade. People found new things to gossip about. The fields needed tending. The trains kept coming. Life has a way of swallowing scandal when there is work to do. The cowboy and Clara kept to their small circle of land and sky. They learned the music of each other's quiet. Sometimes when the day was done, she would ask him to tell her about the places he had seen. He would talk about the desert where the sand glows red at dusk. He would talk about the mountain towns where men sang in the mines to keep fear away. She listened with her eyes closed as if storing each story for some future she had not dared to imagine. He told her once about a woman he had loved long ago. She had left him without goodbye. He said it not for pity but because it was true. Clara said nothing. She only reached across and placed her hand over his heart like a benediction. It was a small act but it steadied him in a way no prayer ever had. One morning the frost came early. The ground turned white and hard. He went out to chop wood and she followed with a blanket around her shoulders. She watched him work for a while, then asked if the cold ever frightened him. He smiled a little. "The cold is only fear made honest," he said. She nodded and said, "Then we are both learning to live with that." He thought about those words for days. She had a way of speaking truth without knowing it was truth. That was what made her stronger than she believed. By the first thaw they had planted again. The soil took the seeds without complaint. The air smelled of rain and smoke. Life had a rhythm that almost felt like forgiveness. Yet sometimes he would see her stare at the hills with a faraway look, and he knew she was remembering. He never asked what she saw there. Some ghosts must be faced in silence. One evening she came to him by the barn. She had a small bundle in her hands. Inside was the locket he had given her months ago. It had been his mother's. She held it out and said, "I think you should keep this." He shook his head. "It belongs to whoever remembers why it was given," he said. She smiled a small, sad smile. "Then I will wear it," she said, and did. The days passed slow and good. They began to laugh sometimes. Real laughter, not the kind that hides sorrow. He found himself humming when he worked and she began to sing again when she baked. It was not joy yet, but it was close. There were still nights when she woke in fear. He would rise and sit with her until the tremor left her hands. He never asked what she dreamed. He only said, "We are here now," and that seemed to be enough. He learned that love is not a grand thing, it is a steady thing. It is a meal shared in silence. It is the patience to wait for someone to find their own light. He had once thought he had rescued her. Now he understood that she was rescuing him each day in small and quiet ways. She gave him a reason to stay still long enough to grow roots. One night they sat by the river again. The moon laid a path of silver on the water. She said, "Do you think we were meant to meet that day?" He looked at her and said, "Maybe we were just both tired of being alone." She smiled and said maybe that is what meant to is. The fire burned low. The night wrapped around them like an old friend. He thought about the road that had led him here and the roads that still called. He knew he would ride again someday, but not yet. There was still something left to build before the dust claimed him again. Spring stretched wide and gentle across the land. The grass came back green and soft underfoot. The river ran fuller with meltwater from the mountains, and every night the wind carried the smell of new earth. The cowboy watched it all with quiet wonder. He had lived through many seasons, yet this one felt different. It felt earned. Clara moved through the days with a calm that came from somewhere deep inside. She laughed more. She sang when she cooked. She would step out at dusk and stand in the doorway and close her eyes as if listening for the sound of her own heart, learning to trust again. He saw this and felt a pride that had no shape, only warmth. One morning he rode into town for supplies. The streets were dust and noise. Men shouting over prices and horses stamping their feet. He tied his horse and walked to the store. Inside he felt the familiar hush that comes when an outsider steps in. He tipped his hat and spoke little. The storekeeper nodded without smile or scorn. The old hostility had thinned, but it was not gone. As he paid for the flour and beans, a woman stepped from the side shelf. She was older than Clara, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You still keeping that girl out there?" she said. Her tone was not cruel but full of something he could not name. He met her eyes and said, "She is her own now." The woman studied him, then nodded slow. "Some folks are meant to be free," she said. "Others are meant to help them." Remember how he rode home thinking about those words. They settled in his mind like dust that would not blow away. When he reached the ridge, he saw Clara kneeling in the garden with her sleeves rolled up and the sun catching her hair. The sight struck him still. There was something sacred in the way she worked the earth, something that made all the noise of the world fall away. That evening he told her what the woman had said. Clara listened and smiled. "Maybe she was right," she said. "Maybe freedom is a thing we give back to each other." He nodded slow. "Freedom and forgiveness," he said. She looked at him. "Do you still need forgiving?" she asked. He thought a while. "Not from you," he said. "From the man I used to be." For a long time she was quiet. Then she said, "Maybe that man only lived long enough to bring you here." That thought stayed with him through the night. He lay awake and watched the moon crawl across the ceiling and wondered if every soul was given one chance to set something right. The next morning a rider came down the trail. He was young, with dust on his face and trouble in his eyes. He said the sheriff was asking again. Said there was a man in town claiming the girl belonged to him by old right. The cowboy felt the old anger rise like a fire that had been waiting for air. He thanked the boy and sent him off. Then he went to the barn and saddled his horse. Clara met him by the gate. Her eyes were steady. "You going to face him?" she asked. "I am," he said. She nodded. "Do not fight him," she said. "Just make him see what I have become." He took her hand for a moment. Her touch was warm and strong. Then he rode out toward town. The man was waiting near the saloon. He was big and mean, with the look of one who had never known peace. When he saw the cowboy, he smiled thin and bitter. "You took what was mine," he said. The cowboy looked at him and said, "No, I took what should never have been yours." The man spat and stepped closer. "You going to make this right?" he said. The cowboy shook his head. "It already is right." The street had gone still. The townsfolk watched from the shadows. The sheriff stood by his door, hand near his gun, but not moving. The man laughed a low, cruel sound. He said, "The law is on my side." The cowboy said, "Then the law is wrong." He turned to walk away. The man reached for his gun. The sheriff called out, but the sound was lost in the thunder of one shot. When the smoke cleared, the man lay on the ground, his hand still clutching the pistol that had fired too slow. The cowboy stood unmoving. The sheriff came forward and looked from one to the other. He said it was self-defense and no one spoke against it. The cowboy walked away without a word. By the time he reached the ridge, the sun was low and red. Clara was waiting at the fence. She saw his face and knew. She said nothing. He took her hands and said, "It is done." She looked at him long and said, "Then now we must live like it means something." That night they sat by the fire in silence. The world outside was still. The stars looked close enough to touch. Clara said, "I used to think peace was a place. Now I think it is a person." He said, "Maybe it is both." She smiled and said, "Then we have found enough of it for tonight." Days passed. The sheriff came once more to tell him the matter was closed. The town had moved on. The cowboy thanked him and went back to the fields. He worked from dawn till dusk and found that the rhythm of labor was its own prayer. Clara baked and sang, and the air of the small house filled with the smell of life. Yet sometimes he would catch her looking west toward the mountains. One evening he asked her what she saw. She said, "The road that might still be calling you." He said, "I have walked enough roads." She said, "Maybe, but one day you will have to follow it again." He said, "Will you come?" She said, "Maybe, if I am done planting." They both smiled then, and the smile held more truth than promise. The summer came hard and bright. The heat pressed on the land like a hand. Crops withered, water ran thin. The cowboy worked through it all. One afternoon he found Clara by the river, sitting with her feet in the water. Her eyes were far away. She said, "Sometimes I think the world forgets to be kind." He sat beside her and said, "Then we must remind it." She leaned her head on his shoulder. The touch felt light but sure. For a long while they said nothing. The sound of the water filled the spaces between them. He thought about all the miles behind and the quiet grace of this moment. Later that night, as they walked back home, she asked, "Do you ever wonder if the good we do matters?" He said, "It matters to the ones who needed it most." She said, "Then that is enough." He looked at her and said, "Yes, it is." As the weeks rolled on, their bond grew into something unspoken. It was not romance as the world calls it. It was something older, a kind of faith. A belief that broken people could still build something gentle. When autumn came, the trees burned gold across the hills. They gathered the last of the harvest and stored it away. The air smelled of smoke and apples. Clara laughed when a leaf landed in her hair. He watched her and thought that maybe this was what salvation looked like. Not light from above, but warmth shared between two souls who had been cold too long. That night they ate by candlelight. He raised his cup and said, "To the life we found." She raised hers and said, "To the life we saved." They drank in silence. The fire crackled low. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass. He dreamed that night of a younger version of himself standing on a long road at dawn. The horizon glowed red and endless. The dream version of him turned and said, "Thank you." He woke with tears he could not explain. In the morning, Clara found him sitting by the fire. She touched his shoulder and said, "You look far away." He smiled and said, "I was just remembering the man I used to be." She said, "And what of him?" He said, "I think he finally came home." Winter rolled in quiet and heavy. The wind came down from the mountains and wrapped the plains in white. The land slept beneath a weight of snow. The cowboy stacked wood high by the stove and fixed every loose hinge and creaking board inside the house. The air stayed warm with the steady rhythm of their small lives. Clara sewed by the window. The light was pale and cold, but she looked peaceful there with her hands working slow and sure. The cowboy watched her and felt that same stillness settle in him. He had chased so many things once. Now all he wanted was this silence. This proof that peace could grow even in barren ground. At night, the wind howled around the eaves. Sometimes it found its way through the cracks and brushed their faces like a ghost trying to remember them. He would pull another log from the pile and set it on the fire. The flames leaped up and chased the shadows back. He would sit close beside her and listen to the sound of her breathing. It was the sound of home. One morning, Clara woke before dawn. She looked out across the field and saw something moving slow in the gray light. A man on horseback. He rode with the kind of weight that came from sorrow. When he reached the yard, he stopped and tipped his hat. His face was lined and tired. The cowboy stepped out to meet him. The man said, "My name is Samuel. I am her father." The words cut through the cold air like a blade. Clara stood in the doorway, frozen. The man dismounted and said, "I have been looking for you since the day they sold you." The cowboy saw the pain in his eyes. It was old pain, the kind that never leaves. Clara stepped forward but stopped halfway. Her voice was small but steady. "Why now?" she said. Samuel said, "Because I was a coward then and I am done being one. I lost your mother to fever. I lost you to greed. I will not die with both sins on my back." The cowboy watched as she walked to him. They stood close but did not touch. Tears hung on her lashes. "You let them sell me," she said. He nodded. "I did. I thought I could buy you back. But by the time I had the money, you were gone. I searched every camp, every town. Then I heard the story of the cowboy who would not look away. I prayed it was you." Clara looked at him a long time. The cowboy wanted to step in to shield her from the storm inside her, but he knew this was not his moment. Finally she said, "I do not know if I can forgive you." Samuel said, "Then let me earn it." He stayed the night in the barn. The next morning he helped with the chores without being asked. He mended fences and chopped wood. He spoke little. Clara watched him work with cautious eyes. Each day he rose early and gave more of himself to the land. Slowly her anger softened, though it did not vanish. The cowboy saw the change. He saw how pain and love could live side by side without destroying each other. One evening Samuel sat with him by the fire. He said, "I thank you for saving her." The cowboy said, "I only did what any man should." Samuel shook his head. Not every man would have done it. Days turned to weeks. The snow began to melt. One morning Samuel packed his things. Clara came out to meet him. She said, "I cannot forget what happened, but I see that you are trying to make it right." He said, "That is all I have left to offer." She hugged him then. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was the start of it. He rode away with tears freezing on his face. That night Clara sat quiet. The cowboy poured her tea and said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Lighter." Like something that was locked inside finally breathed again. He nodded. "Sometimes letting go is the only way to keep living." She smiled faintly. "You speak like a preacher." He said, "No, just a man who has walked through fire." Spring came again. The river swelled and the grass rose green. Life crept back into the valley. The townsfolk had softened toward them. Some stopped by to trade. Others came just to talk. The story of what had happened spread like wind through wheat. They called the cowboy a man of quiet mercy. He never liked the sound of it, but he did not fight it either. One day a small girl from town brought a letter. It was from Samuel. He had joined a church caravan heading east to rebuild a settlement. He wrote that he prayed for them each morning. Clara read the words with a strange smile. She said maybe some souls can find a second chance after all. The cowboy said, I reckon that is the only kind worth finding. As the days grew longer, they built a new barn together. It was hard work, but honest. Clara laughed when the hammer slipped from his hand and landed in the mud. He laughed too. That sound carried across the valley like sunlight made of sound. When the barn was done, they stood back to look at it. It was plain but strong. She said, it will outlast us both. He said, then we built something good. That night, as the sun went down, the sky turned gold and pink. The land seemed to glow. Clara said, do you ever think about the day you found me? He said, every morning when I wake up. He said, do you regret it? He said, no, not once. She took his hand. Her eyes were soft but steady. Then she said, I think we both were saved that day. He nodded. Maybe that is how saving works. You never do it for yourself, but it changes you all the same. As summer deepened, they settled into a peace that felt unshakable. They planted more crops. They shared meals with neighbors who once had turned away. The cowboy started fixing tools for folks who could not pay. He said it was not charity, it was just the right thing to do. Clara taught the children of the valley how to read. She said words were another kind of freedom. Every night they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. The silence was never empty. It was full of all the things they did not need to say anymore. One evening, as the first autumn chill touched the air, Clara said, I used to think the world was cruel and nothing more. He said, and now, she said, now I think cruelty is just the absence of love. He said, then maybe love is the work of filling that absence. She smiled. Then let us keep working. That night, he dreamed again. He saw the road stretching wide beneath a red sky. But this time he was not alone. Clara walked beside him. They did not speak. They did not need to. When he woke, he felt a quiet joy he could not name. The next day he carved 2 small wooden figures, one of a man holding out his hand, one of a woman standing strong. He set them on the mantel. Clara saw them and said, what are they? He said, a reminder. She said, of what? He said, of what it means to not look away. Outside, the wind carried the smell of harvest. The fields shone gold in the morning light. The cowboy stood on the porch and looked out across the land. He felt the years behind him like pages in a story almost done but not yet closed. Not yet. Inside, Clara hummed a tune soft and low. It drifted through the air and wrapped around him like warmth. He thought then that maybe redemption was not a single act but a lifetime of small mercies, a choice made again and again. The sun rose higher. The day began, and somewhere deep inside the cowboy knew that the story he and Clara had written together would outlast both their names. The years passed quiet as dust on an old road. The valley changed, but slowly, like it respected the rhythm of their lives. The river cut a deeper path through the land. The barn weathered gray but stood firm. The fields still turned gold each fall, and the sound of laughter still drifted from the porch when the wind was kind. Clara's hair turned silver before he noticed it happening. One morning he looked at her in the light and saw that time had laid its gentle hand on her. Her face held the same calm strength as ever. It was the face of someone who had fought her battles and found peace with the scars. He loved her for that quiet strength. He loved her for how she never let bitterness take root. The cowboy had aged too. His back carried the years like a heavy saddle. His hands were rougher and his breath shorter, but his eyes still held the same clear steadiness that once faced down cruelty and refused to turn away. When he worked the fields, the children of the valley would come to watch. They called him Mr. Sam, though that was not his real name. He never corrected them. He liked the sound of belonging. Sometimes in the evenings they would visit Clara and sit by her stove while she told them stories. She spoke of the old days, but never with anger. She told of a time when kindness was scarce and how one act of courage could change everything. The children would listen wide-eyed. When they asked who the cowboy was, she would just smile and say he was someone who remembered what it meant to be human. The cowboy would sit outside during those nights listening through the window. Her voice was soft and sure. It reached him like the sound of a faraway church bell. He knew then that whatever he had done had been enough. As the winters grew colder, his strength began to fade. He could no longer mend fences or lift the heavy sacks of grain. Clara took over more of the chores, though she never let him see the worry in her eyes. He still rose each morning before dawn to light the fire. That was his promise to her. The flame would always be there first. One morning he did not wake right away. The light had filled the room and the fire had gone low. Clara touched his shoulder and whispered his name. He opened his eyes and smiled. The lines on his face deepened with it. He said, I had the dream again, the one with the road. She asked, was it long? He said, long and bright. She said, and were you alone? He said, not this time. She held his hand a long while. Neither spoke. The silence between them felt holy. Later that day he went to sit on the porch. The air was cool and full of the smell of pine. He looked out across the valley that had once been wild and empty. It was alive now with farms and smoke rising from chimneys. He thought of all the hands that had built it, all the hearts that had chosen kindness when cruelty was easier. Clara came and sat beside him. They watched the sun sink behind the hills. He said, do you ever wonder what might have happened if I had looked away that day? She said, no, because you didn't, and that is all that matters. He nodded slow. His eyes stayed on the horizon where the light faded soft and gold. He said, I think the good we do becomes the light that never fades. She said, then the world will never be dark again. When the last of the light slipped behind the ridge, he took a deep breath and let it go slow. His head leaned back against the chair, and his hand rested in hers. The air grew still. Clara felt the moment shift like the turning of a page. She whispered his name again, but the wind took it from her lips. She sat there through the night. The stars came out one by one. She did not cry. She just held his hand until dawn painted the valley in pale gold. When the first light touched his face, she smiled. You made it home, she said. The town came to help. They buried him on the hill above the farm where he could see the river and the fields he had loved. The preacher spoke plain words about mercy and redemption. Clara stood alone by the grave long after the others had gone. She traced her fingers through the grass and said, You taught me how to live. That is enough. Seasons turned again. The years kept rolling like the wheels of a distant wagon. Clara stayed in the valley. She tended the land and kept the fire burning every dawn. Children grew into men and women and still came to her for stories. She told them of the cowboy who refused to look away, of the day he found her and how he gave her back her life with nothing but kindness. She said the world is full of pain but also full of hands willing to heal it. One evening as the sun fell red and low, she walked up to the hill. She sat beside his grave and closed her eyes. The wind moved through the grass, whispering soft. It sounded like his voice. She smiled and said, I am not alone. When the night came, the stars burned bright over the valley. The moon rose high and white. The land slept in peace. And somewhere beyond the horizon where all roads meet, the cowboy rode once more beneath an endless sky. His heart was light, his eyes clear. The sound of hooves echoed like a heartbeat across eternity. They say even now when the wind turns gentle and the dusk glows gold, if you listen close you can hear that rhythm in the air. A reminder of what it means to see the world's pain and choose not to turn away. For mercy never dies. It only changes shape. It becomes the hands that lift, the words that heal, the fire that keeps the night from swallowing the heart. And those who carry it forward become part of a story older than time itself. So when the dust settles and the roads stretch quiet under the sun, remember the cowboy who gave all he had without asking for anything in return. Remember the girl who found her freedom in kindness. And remember that every soul that chooses compassion writes its name in the wind where it can never fade. The valley endures. The river still sings. And in the hush of evening, when the world holds its breath, you can almost hear his voice again, telling the tale not with words but with a silence that follows a life well lived. That is how legends are born. Not from glory or gold, but from hearts that refuse to forget what mercy feels like. And as long as someone remembers that feeling, the story will live on forever.